Hello and welcome to yet another exhilarating video. This is geometry and this is section 8 and this is using triangle congruence theorem. So the one thing that we haven't talked about is kind of the last one. We have all these triangle congruency theorems using side, 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 angle, angle, side, side, angle, side, angle, side, angle, and hypotenuse with Lieutenant Dan's magic legs. Hypotenuse leg. Okay, so what we have, when you prove a triangle congruent, you know that the corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So we have this thing called Cpctc, or as I like to say, okay? And so that means, and let's write that in here, that means that corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Okay, so let's just think of an example here, okay? And we can choose any of these. I'll just go ahead and use side, 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 because I like that one. That's one of my favorite ones. But let's just go in here and let's just say that we have some scalene triangle like this. I'll call it A, B, C. And then let's say we have another triangle, another congruent triangle. Imagine that they're congruent. We'll call this D, E, F. Okay, so let's say that I know this, that segment AB is congruent to segment DE. Okay, let's say that segment BC is congruent to segment EF. And then let's say that we have segment AC is congruent to segment DF. Okay, and so what I know, all right, is that these triangles are congruent by side angle or by side, side, side. So what I have here is that let's say that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF, okay, by side, side, side. All right, so because I have said that these triangles are now congruent, okay, this statement up here, then this saying that so let's write this, that saying that the triangles are congruent, Cpctc, okay, allows us to say that corresponding parts are congruent, that corresponding parts are congruent. So what I mean by that is this, that if I know that they're all that if these triangles are congruent, and I only know that the sides are congruent, just because I now know that the triangles are congruent, I now know that all of my angles, all of my corresponding angles are congruent. Okay, so I can come in here and I can say that, let me finish this up. Okay, that angle A is congruent to angle D, okay? I can say that angle B is congruent to angle E, and I can say that angle C is congruent to angle F, okay? So that's what Cpctc allows me to do. It allows us to say that, okay, now that I know that the triangles are congruent, I can then conclude that all of the corresponding sides and angles, okay, are congruent. All right, and that's the idea. All right, so and we kind of talked about that earlier in the first section when we were talking about what's it called? Just what a congruent figure is, and that's kind of the idea. We're kind of circling back around. All right, so we're going to use Cpctc in a proof. Okay, so what we are given for Christmas is that segment xj is congruent to segment yk, segment xp is congruent to segment yp, and that angle zxj is congruent to zyk. Okay, we're trying to prove that jy is congruent to kx. All right, so this is kind of a tricky proof here. But let's just start off with what we know, okay? Let's just start off with our table, and we're going to come over here and we're going to write in our statements and reasons. So statements and reasons, okay? And the first thing I want to say are the given statements. So first statement number one is that xj is congruent to yk, okay? And segment 2 is that xp is congruent to yp. And that third statement is that angle zxj is congruent to angle zyk, okay? And all three of those are given to us, okay? 'Tis the season to give. So first step, second step, third step, okay? This is given, and this is given, okay? So what I have here, okay, is I have those statements, but let's do this, all right? I know that, because here's what I want to do. I see that I have this triangle here, okay? And then I see that I have this triangle here, okay? And so what I can kind of do is I know they share a common angle here, down here, angle P, and I know that if I could kind of do some manipulation here and show that those two triangles are congruent, then I can state that these sides over here are congruent using Cpctc. So what I'm going to say is that jx plus xp, so let me do this. This is kind of going to be kind of a long proof here. What I'm going to say in step 4 is that jx plus xp is equal to jp. Okay, and then I'm also going to say that ky plus yp, so ky plus yp is equal to kp. All right, and when I do that, I know that because, all right, jx or xj is congruent to yk and xp is congruent to yp, all right, I can then conclude, all right, so step 5, that JP, okay, is congruent to, what do we got? KP, okay? And so the fourth step, what I did was the segment addition postulate. So the segment addition postulate, okay? And then step 5 is substitution, okay? And I'm kind of skipping a couple steps here, but, you know, if we're basically just substituting xj into ky and xp into yp, and then, you know, we kind of just know that. So I am skipping a couple steps here, but I'm just trying to get through this to get through the logic of it. Okay, so here's what we know. We know that this segment, jp, is congruent to segment kp, okay? We also know that yp is congruent to xp, all right? And so what I also know is that angle P is congruent to itself, okay? They share angle P. So angle P is congruent to angle P, all right? And that's the reflexive property. And they share that, and so here's what I get. Okay, let me see the reflexive property. All right, so now what I have, and let me write this in here, is in the blue triangle, I have a side, an angle, and a side. Okay, in the red triangle, I have a side, a same angle, and another little side. So what I can then say is that triangle JPY, okay, so let me write that, triangle, so part 7, okay, triangle JPY is congruent to triangle KPX, okay, congruent to triangle KPX. And the reason we can say that is because of side angle side, okay? So, but now, okay, now that I know that these two triangles are congruent, I know that their corresponding parts are congruent. So I can then conclude that KX, I'm sorry, is congruent to JY. So now my last step here is that final step saying that KX is congruent to segment JY, okay? And the reason why I can say that those two segments are congruent is because of Cpctc, which is corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So because the triangles are congruent, I know that their corresponding parts are congruent as well, okay? So, down over here, it's just a little, refresher. It says, corresponding angles and corresponding sides of congruent figures are congruent, okay? And so here's what we've got. What we know is that, angle F is congruent to angle A, angle D is congruent to angle C, and then DE is congruent to BE. So look, I have an angle, and a side. I have an angle, and a side. And so that would be using this one, okay? But then, once I know that triangle, if I say triangle triangle FDE is congruent to triangle ACB, okay? Once I know that these two triangles are congruent, I then know that these two segments are congruent. I know that these two segments are congruent, and then I can conclude that these two angles are congruent. So you can come in there and you can assume that everything else is congruent because of the corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed this section. I know it's kind of tricky. I know the proofs aren't your, the most favorite thing to do in the world. I enjoy them, and I really value them, okay? So I hope you do too, and we'll see you soon, and see you later. Bye.